The most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled was caught completely exposed, refueling and rearming aircraft on 4 flight decks simultaneously, when American dive bombers appeared overhead at precisely the worst possible moment. 5 minutes later, 3 of those carriers were burning wrecks, and Japan's 6-month rampage across the Pacific was effectively finished. But none of it would have happened if one American commander, flying on fumes with 32 aircraft and no idea where the enemy fleet actually was, had not made a split-second decision to follow a single destroyer racing across empty ocean. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The strategic architecture of the Pacific War rested on a foundation of steel, aluminum, and aviation gasoline. By June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the conflict had evolved into a contest of carrier strike forces, floating airbases that could project power across hundreds of miles of open ocean, launching aircraft that could sink battleships, destroy airbases, and annihilate other carriers. The mathematics of carrier warfare in 1942 were brutally simple. The side that found the enemy first and struck first almost always won. Aircraft carriers could launch devastating strikes against targets hundreds of miles away, but once those aircraft departed, the carriers themselves became floating ammunition depots, tons of aviation gasoline, bombs, torpedoes, and oxygen bottles packed into steel hulls. A single well-placed bomb could transform a carrier into a fireball. The Japanese understood this equation perfectly. They had refined carrier doctrine for a decade, training their pilots until they could land on a pitching deck in total darkness, until their bombing accuracy exceeded anything Western navies believed possible. By June 1942, Japan's Kido Butai, the mobile striking force, had sunk or crippled nearly every major Allied warship in the Pacific. The 4 carriers of this force had annihilated Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, smashed Allied naval power in the East Indies, and driven the British Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean. Their pilots were the finest carrier aviators on Earth, and they knew it. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded this instrument of destruction with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle. Born in 1887, Nagumo had spent 30 years in the Imperial Japanese Navy, rising through the ranks during an era when Japan transformed itself from an isolated island nation into a major military power. He was a cruiser specialist, a conservative tactician who preferred gunfire and torpedoes to the uncertain promise of naval aviation. His appointment to command the Kido Butai in 1941 surprised many officers who believed carrier operations required an aviator's instincts. But Nagumo understood power projection and operational tempo, and he possessed the bureaucratic skill to navigate the complex politics of the Imperial Japanese Navy. His carriers had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with devastating precision, sinking or damaging 8 American battleships in a single morning. They had supported the conquest of Wake Island, the invasion of Rabaul, the assault on the Dutch East Indies. They had raided Darwin, Australia, and Ceylon, sinking British warships and sending the Royal Navy fleeing westward. Nagumo's record was unblemished until Midway. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sarayu, and Hiryu, displaced over 100,000 tons collectively and embarked more than 250 aircraft. These were not the improvised conversions that defined early American carrier development. Akagi and Kaga had been rebuilt from capital ship hulls into purpose-designed fleet carriers with massive hangars, multiple elevators, and sophisticated damage control systems. Sarayu and Hiryu represented the next generation, faster, more heavily armed, designed from the keel up for offensive carrier operations. Together, they represented the apex of Japanese naval power, the sword edge of an empire that controlled nearly 1/6 of the Earth's surface. The philosophical foundation of Japanese carrier doctrine originated in the 1920s, when the Washington Naval Treaty forced Japan to accept a 5-5-3 ratio in capital ships relative to the United States and Britain. Facing numerical inferiority in battleships, Japanese naval planners invested heavily in quality over quantity, seeking technological and tactical advantages that could offset the American material advantage. This led to the development of the Long Lance torpedo, faster, longer-ranged, and more powerful than any Western torpedo, and to intensive training programs that produce naval aviators of extraordinary skill. Japanese carrier pilots trained for years, accumulating thousands of hours of flight time before they were considered combat ready. They practiced carrier landings until they could touch down on a pitching deck in complete darkness. They flew formation maneuvers until 30 aircraft moved as a single organism. This training produced pilots of supreme confidence and capability, but it also created a force that could not easily be replaced if losses mounted. The Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized offensive power above all else. Unlike American carriers, which maintain permanent deck parks of aircraft ready for immediate launch, Japanese carriers stored most aircraft in enclosed hangars below the flight deck. This practice protected aircraft from weather and enemy fire, but it created a crucial vulnerability. Rearming and refueling operations happened in those enclosed spaces, where aviation gasoline fumes accumulated, where bombs and torpedoes sat stacked on roller carts, where a single spark could ignite catastrophe. The Japanese accepted this risk because their doctrine assumed they would always strike first. Their reconnaissance was superior. Their pilots were superior. Their carriers were superior. They would find the enemy, launch a devastating attack, and return to carriers that had already recovered from their own strike operations. The possibility of being caught with aircraft below decks, in the middle of rearming operations, simply did not exist in Japanese planning. It was an impossible scenario, a nightmare that could not happen. On the morning of June 4, 1942, approximately 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, that impossible scenario began to unfold. Nagumo's carriers had launched their first strike against Midway at dawn, sending 108 aircraft to pummel the American airbase and eliminate it as a threat. The attack commander, Lieutenant Joikai Tominaga, reported back that a second strike would be necessary. Midway's defenses remained operational. Meanwhile, Nagumo held back a second wave of 93 aircraft, Kate torpedo bombers armed with Type 91 torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, as insurance against the possible appearance of American carriers. Japanese intelligence suggested no American carriers were in the area. Even if they were, Nagumo's reconnaissance planes would spot them long before they posed a threat. But American codebreakers had read Japan's operational plans. They knew the target, the timing, and the composition of the Japanese force. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, waited in ambush northeast of Midway, positioned to strike Nagumo's force from an unexpected direction. At 7 a.m., a Japanese reconnaissance floatplane finally spotted what looked like American ships. The report was maddeningly vague: 10 ships, course and speed uncertain, no indication of carriers. Nagumo faced a tactical dilemma. Should he hold his reserve strike force ready for possible carriers, or should he order them rearmed with bombs for a second Midway attack? He chose the second Midway strike. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed. On the hangar decks of Akagi and Kaga, maintenance crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes from Kate bombers and replacing them with 800-kilogram land attack bombs. Torpedoes went onto carts. Bombs came up from magazines. Each aircraft required 15 to 20 minutes of work. The process was barely underway when, at 7:28 a.m., the reconnaissance plane sent a correction: enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo froze. He countermanded his previous order. The aircraft would keep their torpedoes. No, wait, get rid of the bombs and reinstall the torpedoes. No, finish the rearming with bombs, but keep the Kate bombers ready with torpedoes. The confusion rippled through the carrier decks. Torpedoes and bombs sat scattered across hangar spaces. Meanwhile, the first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel, many aircraft damaged and requiring immediate landing. Nagumo could not launch a strike with aircraft scattered across his decks. He needed to recover the Midway strike first, then reorganize his forces, then launch a proper attack against the American carriers. It was the correct tactical decision given the information available. It was also a death sentence. At 9:20 a.m., Nagumo began recovering aircraft from the Midway strike. His 4 carriers turned into the wind one by one, slowing to launch and recovery speeds, their flight decks crowded with landing aircraft. The strike force that would have devastated the American carriers, 93 aircraft armed and fueled, sat below decks, waiting. Some aircraft remained on the flight decks, engines running, ready to launch the moment recovery operations finished. Fuel lines snaked across hangar floors. Ordnance carts clustered near the elevators. The carriers were in their most vulnerable configuration, exposed and immobile, when the first American torpedo bombers appeared on the horizon. The Douglas TBD Devastator represented the cutting edge of naval aviation when it entered service in 1937. It was the first all-metal monoplane carrier aircraft in the U.S. Navy, replacing fabric-covered biplanes that looked like they belonged in World War I. The Devastator incorporated enclosed cockpits, retractable landing gear, and hydraulic wing-folding mechanisms, features that seemed revolutionary at the time. But aircraft technology advanced so rapidly in the late 1930s that the Devastator was obsolete by 1941. Its 850 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engine could barely push the loaded aircraft past 200 miles per hour. Compare that to the Mitsubishi Zero, which could reach 330 miles per hour in level flight. The Devastator had no armor protection for the crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires when hit by enemy bullets. Its defensive armament consisted of a single .30 caliber machine gun operated by the rear-seat radio man gunner, woefully inadequate against fighters armed with multiple 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns. Most critically, the Devastator had to approach its target at wave height, flying straight and level at speeds below 115 knots to ensure the torpedo ran properly after release. This made it an easy target for both fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Every torpedo bomber pilot knew the aircraft was a death trap. They flew it anyway because it was the weapon the Navy had. 15 Douglas TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8 off the USS Hornet attacked first. The TBD Devastator was obsolete the day it entered service in 1937. Its single 850 horsepower engine could barely push the aircraft past 200 miles per hour when carrying a Mark 13 torpedo. It had no armor. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its torpedoes had to be dropped from 200 feet or lower, at speeds below 115 knots, within 1,000 yards of the target. Against a maneuvering carrier protected by fighters and anti-aircraft fire, the TBD was essentially a suicide weapon. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo 8 in a textbook attack approach, descending to wave-top height, spreading his aircraft into attack formation. Waldron was a stubborn, aggressive officer of Oglala Sioux ancestry who had fought his way through the Navy's unofficial but persistent discrimination against Native Americans. He believed in direct action and frontal assault, in closing with the enemy and delivering your weapons regardless of the cost. On the morning of June 4, Waldron separated his squadron from Hornet's other strike aircraft because he disagreed with the course being flown. He believed the Japanese carriers were further west than reported, and he turned his squadron accordingly. He was correct, his instinct for carrier operations proved better than the navigation calculations, but his accuracy sealed his fate. Torpedo 8 found the Japanese carriers alone, without fighter escort, without dive bomber support, 15 slow aircraft against the most powerful carrier battle group in the world. Waldron transmitted a final radio message: attack immediately. They never had a chance. Japanese Zero fighters fell on them like wolves. The Zeros could climb at 3,000 feet per minute and reach 330 miles per hour in level flight. They were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with hundreds of combat hours. The slaughter was methodical. Waldron went down first, his aircraft exploding before it hit the water. The other 14 Devastators followed one by one, picked off by fighters or shredded by anti-aircraft fire. Not one torpedo hit. 15 aircraft, 30 men, gone in less than 10 minutes. Only Ensign George Gay survived, clinging to a floating seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. 10 minutes later, 14 Devastators from Torpedo 6 off Enterprise attacked. Same result. 10 aircraft shot down. No torpedo hits. Then 12 Devastators from Torpedo 3 off Yorktown pressed their attack. 10 aircraft lost. No hits. In 30 minutes, American torpedo squadrons had been annihilated, 35 aircraft lost, 80 men dead or missing. The attack had accomplished nothing. except it had pulled every Japanese combat air patrol fighter down to the deck. The Mitsubishi A6M0 represented the apex of Japanese aeronautical engineering in the late 1930s. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi, the Zero was purpose-built to meet an Imperial Japanese Navy specification that seemed impossible: a carrier fighter with the range of a medium bomber, the maneuverability of a biplane, and the firepower to destroy heavy bombers. Horikoshi achieved this through radical weight reduction. The Zero had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal structural redundancy. Every component was optimized for weight savings. The result was an aircraft that could fly 1,900 miles on internal fuel, turn inside any American fighter, and climb faster than anything in the Pacific. In combat, Zero pilots used these advantages ruthlessly. They could outmaneuver pursuing fighters, climb above attacking aircraft, and extend away from danger using their superior range. American pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros died. But the weight reduction came at a cost. Zeros burned easily when hit. Their lightweight structure could not absorb battle damage. A single burst of .50 caliber fire could shred a Zero's wing or ignite its unprotected fuel tanks. The aircraft was a thoroughbred racehorse, magnificent in ideal conditions, fragile when stressed. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the finest carrier fighter in the world in 1942, but it had one critical limitation: it carried no radar, no ground control, no sophisticated command and control system. Zero pilots relied on visual acquisition and voice communication. When American torpedo bombers attacked at wave height, every Zero dove to intercept them. It was instinct, training, and doctrine: stop the torpedo attack before it reached the carriers. The Zeros orbited at sea level, hunting for more torpedo planes, their pilots adrenaline drunk from easy kills, while above them, utterly unnoticed, American dive bombers climbed to 20,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr., Air Group Commander of USS Enterprise, led 33 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers into empty sky. McCluskey was an unlikely hero, a tall, reserved officer from Buffalo, New York, who had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1926 and spent 15 years in routine assignments before the war thrust him into a position of critical responsibility. He was a fighter pilot by training, having flown Grumman F-3F biplanes in the late 1930s, but he understood bombing doctrine and trusted his instincts about where carriers might maneuver in combat. At 9:20 a.m. on June 4, McCluskey launched from Enterprise with strict orders: fly to the reported position of the Japanese carriers, attack, and return. Simple enough in theory. But carrier navigation in 1942 depended on dead reckoning, compass headings, airspeed, time, and estimates of wind drift. Radio navigation aids were primitive. Radar was non-existent on dive bombers. Pilots flew by compass and instinct, hoping their calculations were accurate. McCluskey arrived at the calculated intercept point at 9:55 a.m. and found nothing. No carriers. No smoke. No radar contacts because the SBD had no radar. Just empty ocean extending to the horizon in every direction. His fuel gauges read half full, barely enough to return to Enterprise if he turned back immediately. McCluskey knew that launching a strike force based on intelligence reports 6 hours old and expecting the target to be exactly where predicted was optimistic at best. Carriers maneuvered constantly to launch and recover aircraft, to avoid submarines, to position for strikes. The Japanese carriers could be anywhere within a 50-mile radius of the predicted position. Searching that much ocean would consume fuel he did not have. But McCluskey also knew that finding those carriers was the only way to stop them from launching their own strike against the American carriers. If he returned without attacking, the Japanese would sink Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, and the entire strategic balance in the Pacific would tip permanently in Japan's favor. So McCluskey made the most consequential decision of his life: he kept searching. McCluskey was a fighter pilot by training, an aggressive, instinctive combat leader who had taken command of Enterprise's air group only 2 months earlier. On the morning of June 4, he launched his strike force toward the reported position of the Japanese carriers. He arrived at the designated coordinates and found nothing. Empty ocean. No carriers. No escorts. No smoke on the horizon. McCluskey faced a brutal choice: return to Enterprise with his strike force intact, or continue searching on a fuel reserve that was already approaching the point of no return. He continued searching. McCluskey had no radar, no homing beacon, no sophisticated navigation equipment. He had a compass, a plotting board, and decades of accumulated knowledge about how warships behaved in combat. The Japanese carriers had been reported steaming southeast toward Midway. But what if they had changed course? What if they were maneuvering to avoid attack, or positioning for their own strike? McCluskey reasoned that if the Japanese were preparing to attack American carriers, which they surely knew were in the area by now, they would turn northeast to close the distance. He made a command decision that violated every principle of strike coordination. He turned his formation northwest, away from Enterprise, further into Japanese-controlled waters, flying on fuel reserves that could not possibly get him back to his carrier. The minutes crawled past. Fuel gauges dropped. Pilots glanced at their instruments, calculating the point of no return, then the point past the point of no return. Some aircraft would not make it back even if McCluskey turned around immediately. They were committed now, riding a tactical gamble that would either change the war or result in 33 aircraft ditching in the ocean when their fuel ran out. At 10 a.m., McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast at flank speed, throwing up a massive white wake visible for miles. The ship was IJN Arashi, a Kajero-class destroyer displacing 2,500 tons and capable of 35 knots. Arashi had been detached from the carrier screen earlier that morning with orders to depth charge the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had surfaced repeatedly to attack Japanese ships despite being hopelessly outgunned. Nautilus was a V-class fleet submarine, one of the oldest boats in the U.S. Navy, slow and cumbersome but crewed by men stubborn enough to keep attacking despite being pounded by depth charges. Arashi dropped 42 depth charges on Nautilus, trying to crack the submarine's pressure hull or force it to surface where guns could finish it. But Nautilus went deep, absorbed the punishment, and waited. Eventually, Arashi broke off the attack. The carrier battle was developing rapidly, and Arashi needed to rejoin the fleet. The destroyer turned northeast and accelerated to flank speed, racing to catch up with the carriers. Her captain did not know that American dive bombers were overhead, watching, following. The ship was Arashi, the destroyer that had been depth charging the American submarine USS Nautilus. Arashi had dropped 42 depth charges on the stubborn submarine, which had surfaced repeatedly to shoot at Japanese carriers despite being hopelessly outgunned. Now Arashi was rushing to rejoin the carrier formation, and she was heading straight toward it at maximum speed. McCluskey followed Arashi's wake like a highway in the sky. 20 minutes later, at 10:20 a.m., he spotted the Japanese carriers. For carriers in a loose diamond formation, surrounded by battleships and cruisers, their wakes white crescents in blue water. Flight decks crowded with aircraft. No combat air patrol at altitude. McCluskey transmitted a simple radio call, "Target enemy carriers," and rolled into his attack dive. The Douglas SBD Dauntless emerged from a design competition in the mid-1930s, when the U.S. Navy sought a replacement for aging biplane dive bombers. Ed Heinemann, chief designer at Douglas Aircraft, created an aircraft optimized for a single mission, dive bombing with maximum accuracy. The SBD was not fast. Its 1,000 horsepower Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine pushed the loaded aircraft to only 250 miles per hour. It was not particularly maneuverable compared to fighters. It had limited defensive armament, 2 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns and twin .30 caliber guns in the rear cockpit. But the SBD possessed qualities that mattered more than speed or agility: stability, strength, and precision. The perforated dive brakes were the key innovation. When deployed, these panels, mounted on the trailing edges of both wings and pierced with hundreds of 3/4-inch holes, created massive drag that allowed the SBD to dive at angles up to 70 degrees without accelerating beyond terminal velocity. The holes prevented buffeting that would have made accurate aiming impossible. Pilots could push the nose over until the world tilted vertical, until the target filled their entire field of view, and the aircraft remained stable enough to adjust aim continuously during the descent. The bomb release yoke swung the weapon forward and down, ensuring it cleared the propeller arc. The airframe was strong enough to handle the pullout from a 70-degree dive at 250 knots, G-forces that could crack inferior airframes or cause structural failure. Pilots routinely pulled 6GS during dive recovery, experiencing forces that grayed their vision and drained blood from their brains. The SBD absorbed this abuse mission after mission. It was not glamorous. Pilots joked that SBD stood for slow but deadly. But when the time came to put a bomb through a carrier's flight deck, the SBD Dauntless was the most effective weapon in the world. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was the aesthetic opposite of the Elegant Zero. It looked like a blue brick with wings, slow and unlovely, derided by pilots as slow but deadly. But the SBD was a purpose-built dive bomber optimized for one specific mission, putting a bomb through a ship's deck. Its perforated dive brakes, panels on the trailing edges of the wings pierced with hundreds of 3/4-inch holes, allowed the aircraft to dive at angles up to 70 degrees without exceeding terminal velocity. When those brakes deployed with a distinctive whoomp, the SBD became a stable, controllable bomb delivery platform even in a near-vertical dive. Pilots could adjust their aim continuously during the descent, compensating for target maneuvers, wind drift, and defensive fire. The Dauntless could carry a 1,000-pound bomb under the fuselage on a yoke that swung the weapon forward and down when released, preventing the bomb from striking the propeller. The aircraft was sturdy enough to absorb significant battle damage and still return home. It was not fast. It was not glamorous. But it was the most accurate dive bomber in the world. McCluskey split his formation. He would lead Bombing Squadron 6, 17 aircraft, against the nearest carrier, Kaga. He ordered Scouting Squadron 6, another 17 aircraft under Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, to hit the second carrier. In reality, the tactical situation was too fluid for precise coordination. Some aircraft attacked Kaga, some targeted Akagi, some went after whatever target presented itself. The important thing was that 33 dive bombers were pushing over into their attack dives almost simultaneously, converging on carriers that had no fighters at altitude to stop them. Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best, commanding officer of Bombing 6, led his own section of 3 aircraft in a more deliberate attack. Best was a perfectionist, a demanding officer who drilled his squadron relentlessly on dive bombing techniques. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1932 and accumulated nearly a decade of flight experience before the war. Unlike many dive bomber pilots who came from observation or patrol squadrons, Best was a dedicated bombing specialist who understood the mathematics of trajectory, the physics of terminal velocity, the geometry of the dive angle. He knew that hitting a carrier required not just courage but precise calculation, adjusting for wind drift, target speed, target course changes, bomb ballistics. A carrier maneuvering at 30 knots could move 500 feet in the time it took a bomb to fall from 15,000 feet. Pilots had to aim not at where the ship was, but where it would be when the bomb arrived. This required continuous mental calculation during a dive that lasted less than 30 seconds, while anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts of shrapnel, while the G-forces of the dive pressed pilots into their seats, while adrenaline flooded their systems and made fine motor control difficult. Best trained his pilots to handle all of this, to maintain calm during chaos, to trust their instruments. The same fundamental vulnerability, their hangar decks were packed with fueled and armed aircraft at the moment American bombs penetrated their flight decks. The resulting fires and explosions created conditions that Japanese damage control procedures were never designed to handle. Aviation gasoline burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Bomb and torpedo warheads detonated sympathetically, their explosions triggering adjacent weapons in cascading failures. Fire mains ruptured, cutting off water supplies to hose teams. Electrical systems failed, plunging hangar spaces into darkness. Ventilation systems drew smoke into every compartment, suffocating crew members who might otherwise have fought the fires. Japanese carriers had relatively sophisticated damage control systems by the standards of 1942, fire curtains to isolate hangar bays, CO2 flooding systems, trained damage control parties, but none of these measures could contain fires of this magnitude. Within minutes of the first bomb hits, all 3 carriers were beyond saving. The aircraft that were supposed to deliver Japan's counterstrike against the American carriers were instead exploding on hangar decks, adding fuel to fires that could not be contained. Japanese damage control teams fought desperately, running hoses into hangar spaces filled with smoke and flame, trying to isolate fires, trying to get crews to the forward magazines before they detonated, but the secondary explosions kept coming. Soryu and Kaga sank that evening. Akagi lingered until dawn the next morning before she was scuttled by torpedoes from Japanese destroyers. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, was not spotted during the initial attack. She survived long enough to launch 2 counterstrikes against USS Yorktown, crippling that carrier with bomb and torpedo hits. But American dive bombers found Hiryu that afternoon and subjected her to the same treatment. 4 bomb hits turned Hiryu into another blazing wreck. She sank early the next morning. In roughly 8 hours of combat, Japan had lost all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, along with 248 carrier aircraft and over 3,000 men, including some of the finest naval aviators in the world. The Battle of Midway fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific. Before Midway, Japan held the initiative. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive. The loss of 4 fleet carriers could not be quickly replaced. Japan had 2 more large carriers under construction, but they would not be operational for months. More critically, Japan had lost the core of its carrier aircrew, the veteran pilots who had trained for years, who knew how to land on a moving deck at night, who could hit a moving ship from 12,000 feet. Training replacements would take years Japan did not have. The Imperial Japanese Navy would fight on for 3 more years, but it would never again possess the overwhelming carrier superiority that defined the first 6 months of the war. The immediate aftermath of the dive bombing attack saw Japanese carriers transformed into drifting infernos. On Akagi, fires spread from the hangar deck upward to the flight deck and downward toward the engineering spaces. The ship's crew fought desperately to contain the damage, but secondary explosions kept erupting as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the heat. Admiral Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara, forced to abandon his flagship. Akagi drifted helplessly, her steering gear damaged, her communication severed, her once pristine flight deck warped by heat. Japanese destroyers came alongside to evacuate wounded crew members, pulling burned and injured men from the water. Akagi lingered through the afternoon and into the night, her fires gradually consuming the ship from within, until destroyer torpedoes finally sent her to the bottom at dawn on June 5. Kaga sank faster. The multiple bomb hits had ruptured her fuel lines and started fires in her lower decks that quickly spread beyond control. The ship's heavy armor, which was supposed to protect against shell fire, trapped heat inside the hull and accelerated the destruction. Kaga began listing shortly after noon, her hull glowing red from internal fires, secondary explosions throwing debris hundreds of feet into the air. She capsized and sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4, taking 811 crew members with her. Soryu succumbed even more rapidly. The 3 bomb hits detonated in nearly perfect spacing, forward, midships, and aft, creating fires that isolated damage control parties and prevented coordinated response. The ship lost power within 30 minutes. She was abandoned at 10:45 a.m. and sank at 7:13 p.m., just 8 hours after the attack. Hiryu, the only Japanese carrier to survive the morning attack, launched 2 counterstrikes that crippled USS Yorktown before American dive bombers found her that afternoon and subjected her to the same treatment her sister carriers had received. 4 bomb hits turned Hiryu into another blazing wreck. She was scuttled early on June 5. The Battle of Midway was effectively over by the evening of June 4, though skirmishing continued for another 2 days as American forces pursued retreating Japanese ships and aircraft. The tactical brilliance of the American victory at Midway has been debated for 8 decades. Was it luck? Was it skill? The truth is that it was both. The torpedo bomber attacks were catastrophically unsuccessful in conventional terms, 35 aircraft lost without a single hit, but they accomplished the critical task of pulling Japanese fighters down to wave height at precisely the moment American dive bombers arrived overhead. McCluskey's decision to continue searching beyond his designated search area, his decision to follow Arash's wake, his decision to attack immediately despite his aircraft being spread across multiple formations, all of these choices involved significant risk and relied on instinct rather than doctrine. If Arashi had been steaming in a different direction, if the Japanese combat air patrol had been positioned at altitude, if the carriers had completed their recovery operations 10 minutes earlier, the battle might have ended very differently. The human cost of the American attack was significant but far less than the torpedo bomber losses. Of the 54 dive bombers that attacked Japanese carriers that morning, 33 from Enterprise, 17 from Yorktown, plus a small number from Hornet that arrived late, only a handful were lost to enemy action during the actual bombing runs. The dive bombers' high-speed approach, the brief window of vulnerability during the dive, and the overwhelming of Japanese defenses by multiple simultaneous attacks combined to protect American aircraft from the fate that befell the torpedo bombers. More SBDs were lost to fuel exhaustion on the return flight than to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Several pilots, their tanks completely dry, ditched in the ocean and were rescued by American ships. Others made emergency landings on carriers with less than 5 gallons remaining in their tanks. The thin margin between success and disaster was measured in minutes of fuel. And their instincts. Now, over the Japanese carriers, Best demonstrated the standards he demanded from his squadron. When he saw most of McCluskey's formation diving on Kaga, Best pulled out of his dive and repositioned to attack Akagi, the flagship. Best was one of the finest dive bomber pilots in the Navy, a perfectionist who demanded absolute precision from his squadron. Now he demonstrated why. He pushed his SBD into a 70-degree dive, perforated dive brakes deployed, airspeed locked at 240 knots, Akagi growing larger in his bomb sight until individual men on the flight deck became visible. Best held his dive until 2,500 feet, lower than doctrine recommended, deep into the range of light anti-aircraft fire, but close enough to ensure his bomb would hit. He could see individual men on Akagi's flight deck, see the rising sun painted on the wooden planks, see aircraft parked near the island. His bomb sight reticle centered on a point just aft of the midships elevator. At 2,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound Mark 13 bomb and immediately pulled back on the stick, hauling the Dauntless into a dive recovery that generated forces approaching the aircraft's structural limits. The G-forces compressed his body, drained blood from his brain, grayed his vision until he was flying on instruments and instinct. The bomb fell free, arcing downward at terminal velocity, spinning slightly from gyroscopic forces, accelerating past 700 feet per second. The Mark 13 was a semi-armor-piercing weapon with 440 pounds of Torpex explosive, a mixture more powerful than TNT, in a hardened steel case designed to penetrate wooden flight decks and detonate below, maximizing blast effect inside the ship. From release to impact took approximately 3 seconds. Akagi's flight deck crew never had time to react. The bomb struck the deck just aft of the midships elevator, punched through the 2-inch wooden planking, penetrated the thin steel of the hangar deck floor, and detonated in the upper hangar space. The bomb, a Mark 13 semi-armor-piercing weapon with 440 pounds of Torpex explosive, struck Akagi's flight deck just aft of the midships elevator and penetrated into the upper hangar deck. The explosion detonated ammunition and aviation fuel. More critically, it touched off secondary explosions among the 18 Kate torpedo bombers that were fully fueled and armed on the hangar deck, ready to be brought up by elevator for the strike against American carriers. One bomb created a chain reaction that rippled through Akagi's innards. Aviation fuel lines ruptured. Bomb and torpedo magazines ignited. Fire control systems failed. Within minutes, Akagi was engulfed in uncontrollable fires. Kaga was the larger of the 2 carriers attacked by Enterprise dive bombers, displacing 38,000 tons compared to Akagi's 36,500 tons. Originally laid down as a battleship under the 8-8 fleet program, Kaga had been converted to a carrier after the Washington Naval Treaty canceled battleship construction. She was a massive, ungainly vessel with an oddly raked smokestack and a 2-level flight deck that reflected early confusion about optimal carrier design. But she was also formidable, capable of operating 70 aircraft, heavily armored compared to later carriers, equipped with 10 200mm guns for surface combat. On the morning of June 4, Kaga's flight deck was crowded with aircraft returning from the Midway strike, with more aircraft being brought up from the hangar deck for the anticipated attack on American carriers. Fuel lines snaked across the deck. Ordnance carts clustered near the elevators. The ship was in its most vulnerable configuration when Lieutenant Earl Gallagher scouting 6 bombers and portions of Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's bombing 6 arrived overhead. Karga took at least 4 direct hits from Enterprise dive bombers. The first bomb struck near the forward elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding on the hangar deck below. The second and third bombs bracketed the midships elevator. The fourth hit near the bridge, killing most of Karga's senior officers. Like Akagi, Karga's hangar deck was packed with fueled and armed aircraft. The bombs ignited infernos that quickly spread beyond any hope of control. Aviation gasoline fires burned at temperatures that buckled steel. Ordnance cooked off in sustained explosions. The carrier's fire suppression systems, never designed to handle fires of this magnitude, failed almost immediately. At the same moment McCluskey's Enterprise aircraft attacked Akagi and Karga from the southwest, 17 Douglas Dauntless from Bombing Squadron 3 off USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, found the carrier Sarayu approaching from the northeast. Leslie's squadron had experienced a bizarre equipment failure during launch. His bomb release mechanism activated prematurely while he was still on the catapult, dropping his 1,000-pound bomb harmlessly into the ocean. 16 of his pilots still carried weapons, and Leslie led them toward the reported Japanese position despite being unable to attack himself. The convergence of 2 American strike groups on the Japanese carriers from different directions was entirely coincidental. Neither McCluskey nor Leslie knew the other force was nearby. They had launched from different carriers at different times following different navigation courses. Yet they arrived over the target within 5 minutes of each other, creating a coordinated attack that was actually the product of chance and favorable timing. Sarayu was the smallest of the 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, displacing only 18,800 tons, but she was also the fastest and most modern, capable of 34 knots with a flight deck designed for rapid launch operations. Her aircraft complement was 57 planes, smaller than Akagi or Karga but operated by some of the finest pilots in the Kido Butai. On June 4, Sarayu had recovered most of her Midway strike aircraft and was positioning for a counterattack when Leslie's dive bombers appeared overhead. Leslie's approach was nearly perfect. His squadron arrived overhead Sarayu at 10:25 a.m., just as the carrier was maneuvering violently to avoid Enterprise's attack. Leslie split his formation into 3 sections that attacked from different angles, overwhelming Sarayu's anti-aircraft fire and making evasive maneuvers impossible. 3 bombs hit Sarayu in quick succession, 1 forward, 1 amidships, 1 aft. All 3 penetrated the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck, where aircraft were being fueled and armed. The first bomb ignited a massive aviation fuel fire. The second detonated the forward bomb magazine. The third severed critical electrical and fire control systems. Sarayu was doomed within seconds of the first bomb impact. In 5 minutes, from 10:20 a.m. when the first Enterprise dive bombers began their attack runs to 10:25 a.m. when the last Yorktown bombs detonated on Sarayu, 3 Japanese carriers had been reduced to flaming wrecks. The speed and concentration of the attack overwhelmed Japanese damage control capabilities. Akagi, Karga, and Sarayu all suffered from and hundreds of yards of distance. McCluskey himself landed on Enterprise with his fuel gauge reading empty, his engine coughing as the last drops of aviation gasoline sputtered through the carburetor. Had his decision to continue searching taken him 5 minutes further from the carriers, his entire strike force would have run out of fuel before reaching home. But the most critical factor was the dive bomber itself. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was not technologically sophisticated. It carried no advanced targeting systems, no radar, no guided weapons. It was a pilot, a rear seat gunner, 1 large bomb, and an aircraft designed to put that bomb exactly where the pilot aimed it. The perforated dive brakes that gave the SBD its stability in steep dives were the result of years of incremental engineering refinement. The sturdy airframe that allowed pilots to pull out of 70-degree dives at high speed reflected decades of structural design evolution. The bomb sight was a simple telescopic device that required pilots to manually calculate wind, altitude, target speed, and target course, then physically fly the aircraft until the target sat in the center of the reticle. It was a weapon system that demanded extraordinary pilot skill and delivered precision that no horizontal bomber could match. The men who flew the SBD at Midway were not superhumans. They were naval aviators with hundreds of hours of training, but most had never dropped a bomb in combat before June 4, 1942. They were scared, tired, flying aircraft that were nearly out of fuel, diving into anti-aircraft fire so intense it created visible black clouds in the sky. Ensign George Goldsmith, diving on Kaga, saw his bomb hit the carrier's flight deck, so the explosion blossom into flame, and then saw a Zero fighter materialize in front of him. The Zero pilot, desperate to stop the attack, flew straight into Goldsmith's Dauntless. Both aircraft plunged into the ocean. Goldsmith was 23 years old. Lieutenant Dick Best, whose bomb crippled Akagi during the morning attack, flew a second mission that afternoon when American scouts located Hiryu attempting to escape northeast. Best led Bombing 6 back into action, this time with full knowledge of what Japanese defenses could do. Hiryu's combat air patrol was at full strength, her anti-aircraft guns were manned and ready, and her escorts were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The afternoon attack was far more dangerous than the morning surprise, but American pilots pressed home their assault with the same determination they had shown earlier. Best's bomb struck Hiryu's flight deck near the forward elevator, penetrating into the hangar deck and igniting fires among fueled aircraft. 3 more bombs from other pilots added to the destruction. Hiryu burned through the afternoon and evening, her crew fighting fires until Captain Tomio Koku ordered the ship abandoned. Hiryu rolled over and sank at 9 a.m. on June 5, the last of the 4 carriers to go down. Best was one of only 2 pilots to score bomb hits on 2 different carriers in a single day. The other was Ensign Norman Dusty Kleiss, who hit both Kaga and Hiryu. Their achievement represented the pinnacle of dive bombing skill, but it came at a cost that ended Best's career. He was the only pilot to land direct hits on 2 Japanese carriers in a single day. That evening, Best began coughing blood. During his first dive that morning, a faulty oxygen canister in his aircraft had released caustic soda fumes into his breathing mask. The fumes activated latent tuberculosis in Best's lungs. He was medically retired from the Navy in 1944, his career ended by a manufacturing defect in a piece of safety equipment. Best lived to age 91, but he never flew combat missions again. The American victory at Midway would not have been possible without the sacrifices of the torpedo bomber crews who attacked first and drew Japanese fighters down to wave height. This was not part of any coordinated plan. American strike doctrine in 1942 called for coordinated attacks with fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers arriving simultaneously to overwhelm enemy defenses. But coordination proved impossible in the chaos of carrier operations over hundreds of miles of ocean. The different aircraft types flew at different speeds and different altitudes. Fighter pilots struggled to stay with slow torpedo bombers without stalling. Dive bombers climbed to altitude while torpedo bombers descended to wave height. Navigation errors and communication failures scattered the American strike forces across 50 miles of ocean. Each squadron essentially attacked independently, finding the Japanese carriers at different times and from different directions. The torpedo bomber attack seemed like catastrophic failures: 41 aircraft launched, 35 shot down, 0 torpedo hits, only 6 aircraft survived to return to their carriers. By any conventional metric, the torpedo strikes accomplished nothing. But they accomplished the one thing that mattered: they pulled every Japanese Zero down to sea level at precisely the moment American dive bombers arrived at 20,000 feet. The Zero pilots, blooded and confident from slaughtering the torpedo bombers, were hunting for more targets at wave height when the real threat materialized overhead. By the time Japanese lookouts spotted the dive bombers and radioed warnings, it was too late. The Zeros could not climb from sea level to 20,000 feet fast enough to intercept aircraft that were already rolling into their attack dives. The sacrifices of the torpedo bomber crews, men like Lieutenant Commander John Waldron of Torpedo 8, who led his squadron into an attack he knew was suicidal, created the tactical conditions that made the dive bomber attack possible. Waldron's final radio transmission before his Devastator was shot down was a position report giving the location of the Japanese carriers. That information helped guide subsequent strikes. Ensign George Gay, floating in the water amid the wreckage of VT-8, watched the entire battle unfold. He saw the dive bombers arrive. He saw the bombs hit. He saw the carriers burn. He was rescued the next day, the sole survivor of his squadron, and his debriefing provided crucial intelligence about Japanese carrier operations and damage control procedures. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent the entire battle floating in the ocean near the Japanese carriers. He watched the dive bombers attack. He saw the bombs hit and the fires start. He observed Japanese destroyers racing to rescue survivors from the burning carriers. He hid under his floating seat cushion when Japanese aircraft flew overhead, terrified they would strafe him in the water. He floated for 30 hours before a PBY Catalina patrol plane spotted him and pulled him from the ocean, dehydrated and exhausted but alive. Gay's survival was miraculous. He was the only man from his 15-plane squadron to escape the battle. His detailed account of what he witnessed provided American intelligence with crucial information about Japanese carrier operations, damage control procedures, and tactical responses to attack. Gay remained in the Navy after recovering from his ordeal, flew additional combat missions, and survived the war. He carried the memory of his dead squadron mates for the rest of his life, the knowledge that he had survived while 29 other men from Torpedo 8 died in the space of 10 minutes. The Battle of Midway did not end the Pacific War. That war would grind on for 3 more years, through the brutal island campaigns of the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But Midway ended Japan's offensive capability. After June 4, 1942, Japan would fight a defensive war, responding to American initiatives rather than driving its own strategic agenda. The Imperial Japanese Navy remained a formidable fighting force. It would sink dozens of American ships in the battles to come, but it would never again possess the concentrated carrier strike power that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. The strategic implications extended beyond mere numbers of ships sunk. Japan's carrier doctrine emphasized a small number of elite pilots operating from a small number of elite carriers. This created a force of extraordinary capability but brittle resilience. Losing those pilots could not be remedied by simply building more carriers. The United States, by contrast, built carrier aviation on a foundation of mass production and standardized training. American carriers were smaller and individually less capable than Japanese fleet carriers, but America could build them faster and crew them with adequately trained pilots produced by a vast training pipeline. By 1944, the U.S. Navy would operate more than 20 fleet carriers and nearly 100 escort carriers. Japan would never come close to matching that production. The technological lessons of Midway reinforced American confidence in dive bombing as the primary anti-ship weapon. Torpedo attacks, despite their theoretical advantages in hitting below the waterline, proved too vulnerable to fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire. Dive bombers could attack from altitude, achieve surprise, and deliver weapons with precision that torpedoes could not match. The SBD Dauntless remained in frontline service through 1944, sinking more Japanese ships than any other Allied aircraft. Its successor, the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, was faster and carried a larger bomb load, but many pilots preferred the reliable, stable Dauntless. The SBD's simplicity was its strength. It had fewer systems to fail, fewer components to malfunction under combat stress. The human cost of Midway was asymmetric but significant on both sides. The United States lost 307 men, 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 144 aircraft. Japan lost approximately 3,057 men, for carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and 248 aircraft. But the American losses, while painful, were absorbable. USS Yorktown, crippled by Japanese bombs and torpedoes, was finished off by a Japanese submarine 2 days after the battle. But Enterprise and Hornet remained operational. American shipyards were already constructing Essex-class fleet carriers that would join the fleet in 1943. American pilot training programs were graduating hundreds of new aviators every month. The United States could afford to lose ships and men because the industrial base and population could replace them. Japan could not. The Japanese carriers lost at Midway represented a decade of doctrinal development and engineering refinement. Akagi and Kaga were first-generation fleet carriers, converted from other hulls but extensively modernized. Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-built fleet carriers incorporating lessons from years of operational experience. All four were veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and numerous other operations. Their crews knew their ships intimately. Their aircrew were the finest in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Replacing the ships was possible. Japan laid down 2 more large carriers and converted several others from merchant hulls, but replacing the experience and institutional knowledge was impossible. Admiral Nagumo survived the battle. He was not blamed for the defeat. Japanese post-action analysis correctly identified the structural vulnerabilities in Japanese carrier doctrine rather than individual command failures. Nagumo continued to hold operational commands, but he never again commanded a major carrier force. He committed suicide in 1944 during the Battle of Saipan rather than face capture. His death symbolized the broader collapse of Japan's strategic position. The empire that had seemed invincible in early 1942 was steadily ground down by American industrial might and strategic persistence. The strategic geography of the Pacific favored the Americans once they achieved carrier parity. Japan's conquests were scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, connected by fragile sea lanes vulnerable to submarine and air attack. Holding this empire required control of the sea, which required carriers. Losing 4 carriers at Midway did not eliminate Japan's ability to contest control of the Pacific, but it meant Japan could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. The United States could choose where and when to attack, forcing Japan into a reactive posture that bled resources and prevented any coherent offensive strategy. The Battle of Midway also validated the code-breaking effort that had enabled the American ambush. Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to identify Midway as the target and provide accurate intelligence on the timing and composition of the Japanese force. This intelligence allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his carriers for maximum effect despite being outnumbered. The success at Midway justified continued investment in signals intelligence and confirmed that technological advantage in communication security could provide decisive strategic benefits. The United States expanded its code-breaking efforts throughout the war, ultimately reading Japanese communications with near-total transparency by 1945. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Midway rippled through American naval aviation for the rest of the war. The coordination between torpedo bombers and dive bombers, even though that coordination was largely accidental at Midway, became deliberate doctrine in later battles. American strike groups learned to time their attacks so torpedo bombers pulled defending fighters down to the deck while dive bombers attacked from altitude. The tactic worked at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, when American carriers destroyed 3 Japanese carriers and hundreds of aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By that point, the tactical asymmetry was overwhelming. American pilots had radar, better radios, superior aircraft, and numerical superiority. Japanese defenders fought with courage and determination but could not overcome the cumulative advantages of American technology and numbers. The dive bombing attack itself became more sophisticated as the war progressed. Early in the war, dive bomber pilots released weapons based on altitude and visual aiming. By 1944, American dive bombers used radio altimeters, improved bomb sights, and standardized attack profiles that increased hit probability. Aircraft like the Vought F4U Corsair and Grumman F6F Hellcat, originally designed as fighters, were adapted to carry bombs and rockets, expanding the pool of aircraft capable of precision attack. The flexibility of carrier aviation, the ability to configure strike groups with different weapon loads depending on the target, proved to be one of the decisive advantages of American naval power. But the essence of the dive bombing attack, one pilot, one bomb, one target, executed with precision under fire, remained unchanged from Midway to the end of the war. It was not a technological marvel. It was skilled human beings using relatively simple tools to accomplish an extraordinarily difficult task. The SBD Dauntless at Midway carried the same basic weapons and flew the same basic attack profiles as dive bombers in earlier battles. What changed at Midway was not the technology but the convergence of favorable circumstances. Japanese carriers caught at their most vulnerable moment, American dive bombers arriving overhead undetected, and pilots who had trained relentlessly for exactly this scenario executing their attacks with precision despite exhaustion, fear, and near-empty fuel tanks. The legacy of Midway extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. The battle demonstrated that Japan was not invincible, that its strategic expansion could be halted, that its vaunted carrier force could be destroyed by a smaller American force using intelligence, training, and aggressive tactics. This psychological impact mattered as much as the loss of the carriers. Before Midway, Japanese forces expected to win. After Midway, that confidence eroded. American forces, conversely, gained confidence. They had faced Japan's best and won. That confidence permeated American strategic planning for the rest of the war. The battle also established the carrier as the dominant capital ship of the naval era. Midway was decided entirely by carrier aircraft. The massive battleships that accompanied both fleets never came within sight of each other. The future belonged to carriers, not battleships, and the naval powers that understood this truth earliest gained decisive advantages. The United States Navy accelerated its carrier construction programs and built an entire fleet architecture around carrier task forces. Japan, constrained by limited resources and industrial capacity, could not match American production and fell further behind with each passing month. The men who flew at Midway returned to a world that could not fully comprehend what they had experienced. They were celebrated as heroes, awarded medals, promoted, and sent back into combat. Some survived the war. Many did not. The Pacific War was a grinding, brutal conflict that killed men through combat, disease, accidents, and exhaustion. The pilots who sank Japanese carriers at Midway in June 1942 often died in anonymous crashes or were shot down over remote islands whose names no one remembers. Their service was not exceptional. Millions of Americans served, fought, and died in World War II. But their actions on June 4, 1942, changed the strategic balance of the entire war. Wade McCluskey, whose decision to follow Arashi led him to the Japanese carriers, was awarded the Navy Cross. He survived the war and retired as a Rear Admiral in 1956. He wrote little about Midway, gave few interviews, and seemed uncomfortable with the attention his role attracted. In his own estimation, he had simply done his job under difficult circumstances and gotten lucky. But luck, as every combat veteran knows, is often the product of skill, experience, and the courage to make hard decisions under pressure. McCluskey chose to continue searching when turning back would have been justified. He chose to follow a single destroyer on the assumption it was heading toward the carriers. He chose to attack immediately despite his aircraft being scattered and low on fuel. Each choice involved risk. Each choice proved correct. The immediate strategic consequences of Midway rippled outward through Japanese operational planning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and architect of the Midway operation, was forced to cancel the invasion of Midway Island and withdraw his forces to Japan. The loss of 4 fleet carriers represented a catastrophic setback that could not be concealed from the Japanese public or the military leadership. Yamamoto had gambled that a decisive victory at Midway would force the United States to negotiate peace on terms favorable to Japan. Instead, the battle demonstrated that American forces could meet Japanese carriers in battle and destroy them. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. The combined fleet was no longer the dominant force in the Pacific. Future operations would have to be planned around the reality of American carrier strength rather than the assumption of Japanese superiority. The wreckage of the 4 Japanese carriers rests on the seafloor of the Pacific, 3 to 5 miles down in water so deep and so dark that the ships were not discovered until the 21st century. Akagi was located in 2019, resting upright on the bottom, her flight deck surprisingly intact despite the fires that consumed her. Kaga was found the same year, broken into sections but recognizable. Soryu and Hiryu remain more elusive, their final position still subject to debate and exploration. These wrecks are gravesites, protected under international law and treated with the reverence due to places where thousands of men died. They are also historical artifacts, physical evidence of decisions made and actions taken on a June morning 80 years ago. The Pacific War ground on for 3 more years after Midway, through battles that dwarfed Midway in scale and brutality. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944 involved 15 American carriers and 9 Japanese carriers in a sprawling engagement that resulted in another decisive American victory. The Battle of Leyte Gulf later that year was the largest naval battle in history, involving hundreds of ships and lasting 4 days. But neither of those battles changed the fundamental strategic equation the way Midway did. By the time those battles were fought, Japan was already losing. Midway was the point where Japan's offensive capability ended and America's offensive began. The dive bomber attack on June 4, 1942, succeeded because multiple improbable factors converged at the right moment. The torpedo bomber attacks pulled Japanese fighters to wave height. McCluskey's decision to continue searching brought his dive bombers to the right place at the right time. The Japanese carriers were caught in the middle of refueling and rearming operations. Japanese combat air patrol was out of position. American bombs hit vulnerable spots that ignited catastrophic secondary explosions. Remove any one of these factors and the battle might have ended differently. This realization haunted Japanese planners for the rest of the war. They had lost not because of inferior equipment or inadequate training, but because a series of small decisions and chance events accumulated into catastrophe. The evolution of carrier warfare after Midway reflected the lessons learned from the battle. American strike doctrine incorporated deliberate coordination between torpedo bombers and dive bombers, timed to arrive over the target simultaneously rather than sequentially. Escort fighters were assigned specific missions, some to suppress combat air patrol, some to strafe anti-aircraft positions, some to protect the bombers. Radio communications improved, allowing better coordination between strike groups and their carriers. Aircraft were upgraded with more powerful engines, heavier armament, and better protection for crews. The replacement for the TBD Devastator, the Grumman TBF Avenger, was faster, tougher, and carried a more reliable torpedo. The replacement for the SBD Dauntless, the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, could carry a larger bomb load at higher speeds. But many pilots preferred the reliable SBD, which remained in service through 1944 and sank more enemy ships than any other American aircraft. The fundamental tactic of dive bombing remained unchanged because it worked. Pilots in 1945 were still pushing over into 70-degree dives, still aiming through the same basic bomb sight, still pulling out at the last possible moment to maximize accuracy. The technology improved incrementally, but the human skill required remained constant. The question that defined the Pacific War after Midway was not whether Japan could win, but how long Japan could continue to fight and what the cost of that continued resistance would be. Japan's strategic position deteriorated month by month as American forces advanced across the Pacific, capturing islands and establishing airbases closer to Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy fought on with determination and occasional brilliance, but it could not reverse the strategic trajectory. The carriers lost at Midway were irreplaceable not just as hardware but as symbols of Japanese naval power. Their loss marked the end of Japan's strategic offensive and the beginning of a long, grinding defensive campaign that could only end in defeat. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.